to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the program about mental health and addiction. I'm Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in Southern Vermont.
And I'm Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, licensed mental health counselor. And this is our third season of presenting a program about mental health here. The first year I sort of started on my own, and it became apparent that I needed help, so I invited Dr. Kloster to join me. And last year we did a whole series of sort of introductory talks about mental illness and about addiction. And I think in some ways we focused a lot about symptoms. We talked a lot about identification, and we also requested that people send us in questions. But I think one of my hopes is that this season that we can dedicate a little bit more time to talking about recovery and how people get better. What are some of the issues that people face when they're getting better? And again, that idea that, and I shared with you this earlier, that I think recovery is like a multi-dimensional idea. In other words, it's not just absence or the absence of symptoms. It's really about improvement of life. It's about getting better. And that occurs even before you achieve absence and stuff. So that's what I'm hoping we can spend some time on. And we'll have a series of speakers come in this year. That's going to be new and different. And hopefully they can add to the discussion.
Yeah, because I remember I was particularly struck by a teacher one time. And he went around the room and saying, what does it mean to be healthy? And most of us, I think this was like junior high school or high school, we're talking about, well, not being sick. And that's a really limited way of looking at what health might be about. Right, either you're well or you're not is a very sort of black and white sort of issue. And we're talking, if you were really to define being healthy, there'd be so many more aspects to it. Right, physical health, spiritual health, emotional health. And I think that's what we want to do this year is as we kind of look at what recovery means, it's a much richer thing than just symptoms or no symptoms. Right. Or symptoms being in remission or symptoms being in a sort of relapse state.
Right, and I was at a conference up in Montpelier maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and it was the beginning of the idea of mental health advocates. And people talked about being in recovery. Right. And they really liked that term because you saw it in the field of addiction. People would say, oh, I'm an alcoholic, I'm in recovery. And so you began to see people with mental health say, we have the same thing. I mean, the illnesses are not static. They grow, they change. I mean, you always hear this business about how untreated they get worse. You'll hear this with alcoholism. It's progressive in nature and it gets worse. And I think what a lot of people don't appreciate is that recovery is progressive. And it also gets better. But it gets better in spurts, if you will. I mean, sometimes it takes a year or two before you can gain back the trust of your family. Right. Sometimes you can have episodic relapses, or lapses as I refer to them, where you may go back to using, but you're still seeing your therapist, you're still going to meetings, you're still, you know what I mean? So you're, even though you've broken your continuous states of abstinence, I would still make the argument that they remained in recovery because they were in the process of getting better, they were struggling with recovery, and I don't know, I'm sure you have this experience, but people, when you work sometimes with people with different types of mental illness, you can again see that process. Right.
And I think too often people use the term failure, right? Yeah. Like, I had a relapse and a drinking binge, or say stopping taking medication, and maybe the mania of the bipolar disorder sort of rises back up. And on the one hand, life's full of failures, and overcoming them is part of our success. I mean, I often use the example of riding a bicycle. I mean, you would hardly consider that a major failure when you were a child and you fell off your bike, you got back on, you rode, and eventually you got it right. And each of those falls then sort of led to you being a better bike rider.
Right. And I think that sometimes the concern that I have is that a lot of folks with addiction and mental illness have a really poor self-image. And they're sort of, well, I don't want to say they're quick to give up on themselves, but they're sometimes will really go somewhere and say, well, that didn't work, the medicine didn't work, or AA didn't work, and you ask them, what do you mean it didn't work? Well, I tried it. Well, what happened when you tried it? Well, I was sober, I was clean, and I did okay, but I relapsed.
And then forget about the time that they were sober.
That they were sober or clean, or that they were, you see it sometimes with people on medications, and they resent the medications, even though they are in the process of getting better. So I think, again, you know, I mean, when I struggle with some folks I know, and I know it's a lifelong thing, and it is for me, that you don't get well overnight. And, you know, sometimes you struggle and you go forward and then you go back, 2 steps forward, 1 back. I mean, it's just really, and I want to focus on that this year. I really want to like talk more and more and more about the positive aspect of you know, our title, Let's Talk.
Right.
You know,
right.
well, it's also, I saw an ad, a thing in the New York Times where they were working in New York City, and they wanted to talk about, we're willing to listen.
Right.
So it's really what we're encouraging is a dialogue, is a conversation.
Because that was really I mean, not disturbing. It was a hopeful article, but the really amazing thing was this is from NAMI, the National Association of Mental Illness in New York City, and they had done a survey, and they were asking people, do you think that people with mental illness should share this with their family, and share this with their community, share this with their employers? And I was impressed that less than 50% of the people who responded said, yes, you should share this with your family. And I think it went down as far as maybe a quarter for sharing that with your employer, which you can understand if there's this stigma, this idea that we don't talk about this sort of thing.
Right.
Then that really has an impact. So they've started this campaign, I Will Listen, and featuring a lot of people who wish they'd listened to, say, relatives with depression who've maybe committed suicide because they got no treatment, they've got no support, and in that hopeless state then, you know, wind up taking their lives.
Right. And I recently, last month, I went down to Greenfield to see a film about anonymous people. And this was a film about, and what they're really asking for is that people who are in recovery from addiction, alcoholism and addiction, traditionally, they want to respect AA and the anonymity and not talk about it, you know, at the level of press, radio, and films. But at the other time, they felt that they should be stronger advocates for people in recovery.
To speak out.
Now, I was talking to a friend of mine who I greatly respect, and he goes, well, I don't think addicts and alcoholics should get special treatment. And, you know, why don't they just, you know, live their life and move on and everything.
Right.
And the people in the film were saying, well, it's not so much special treatment, but we want equal. We want equal opportunities. We want equal opportunity to say, yes, it's true, we had this illness, it's treatable, and we're getting better. We're getting better with it.
Yeah.
And not that people, there's an element of shame to it. I mean, there's just no other way to talk about it. There's an element of shame. There's an element of, it must be their fault that they become a drug addict. Now, when you think about all the people who experiment with drugs, how many of those who experiment with drugs were planning on becoming drug addicts?
Yeah, I don't think that was anybody's goal.
No.
I would like to be an
all.
addict when
That's
I grow up, right?
And you know, both of them, I mean, if you heard me last year or us talk about it, there's a genetic factor also.
Yeah.
There's environmental factors. There's a lot of different reasons why, a lot of different pathways to addiction and alcoholism and mental illness too. And yet, I think we tend to hold the individual responsible. And yes, it's true, they should be held responsible for their behaviors, and I get all that. But on some level, I don't think I mean, I guess you can be ashamed. I don't know. I guess I really want to have people feel positive about their recovery, about the concept that they're working on recovery. And whatever that means. And I'm hoping that we can do that this season.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's so many different levels to it as well. I mean, we talk about people sort of stopping their medications or having a relapse. You know, right, we try to think about this as a circle as opposed to sort of a straight line. So many times there's sort of the outpatient treatment, and there might be, you know, like AA, NA, and sometimes people wind up being in the hospital, and that was associated with serious relapses. And rather than seeing that again as a failure like a lot of people do, this is really just kind of a more aggressive treatment that's required when the illness becomes more serious.
Right.
And unfortunately, people always think of that as a failure, as opposed to looking at the various times they've gone through this cycle, and many times realizing, though, we might seem to be repeating a cycle over a couple of years. Oh my God, I've been here before, I've done this before. I think that a lot of times when you then sort of examine again where you might be at any spot in that cycle, we often find that you're at a higher place. That the relapse on the depression or on the alcoholism is not quite as intense as the previous time. The duration of it, how long it lasts, is a shorter period of time. And you find there's sort of more positives and more richness in your life, despite these episodes where the illness really rises up and sort of takes control.
Yeah, and I think occasionally, and not all the time, but a lot of times when you're working with grief sometimes and sadness, sometimes people look for who to blame. Almost like, how do we explain this? And I think years ago they used to worry about if a child became mentally ill or had schizophrenia, that somebody would blame a family member, or it was, their fault or something. And I hope there's no one out there that believes that anymore.
Right. Psychiatry was famous for blaming the mother, right?
Well,
right.
I wasn't going to go there. I don't know,
but
but the idea is that I think that's one of the dangers, both with addiction and alcoholism, that people are looking for a reason to not necessarily understand it. It's more like, well, who caused it? Is it your fault or your fault? And I think part of the focus of recovery is it's not about blame anymore. It's not about, let's deal with what we have here now. Let's talk about what we have now. Like I spend a lot of time sometimes with folks who want to know why they became an alcoholic, or why are they struggling with PTSD. And it's sort of like, well, and I want to say to them, well, that's fine, but let's talk about now, and let's talk about what you can do now. What would you like to do to make your life better?
I mean, you see this a lot of times in therapy, too, where people want to sort of go back and analyze their childhood and time with their parents and all these events that happen. And that's often a fruitless exploration. Yeah. Sometimes you just have to look and say, this is what it is right now. Right. And I know I've had some, say, friends with cancer who, or again, like you're saying, going through all these stages, sort of being in denial and being angry and then finally accepting it, that when they come to the point of saying, it is what it is. It's like, it's just, I've got to work with this. I've got to deal with this, and there's this acceptance there that's really important if you're going to get involved with your recovery, as opposed to sort of fighting it or blaming somebody else.
Right, and that's one of the reasons we picked this title when we talked about, let's talk. It was really this idea that if we can talk about it, we can acknowledge it. We can, say that it's there. And really, in some ways, I really believe this. Even before you go to therapy or treatment, you're already started recovery. Just the day that you sort of own it. You know what I mean? Like the day you finally say, yes, this is it. This is something, I'm struggling with it, and I need help with it. Like I sometimes, when I worked with addicts and alcoholics, they would often date their recovery with their first day of abstinence. Mm-hmm. And I used to share with them that, in my opinion, somewhere out there, even before they got to the hospital, they decided, this isn't good enough. I want to do something.
Well, when they ask that question, do you think I'm addicted?
Yeah.
Right? That's the start of something.
When
the
they
seed
begin
that's
that
been
process,
planted there.
Or they even say, I wonder if I could get help. I wonder if I can stop. And they literally start looking around at this idea about, getting... I often think in some ways that's the beginning of recovery. And the clue is that for some folks, at the moment they ask that, they do get better. And they get better without help of doctors, nurses, hospitals. I mean, they really do. But for most of us, and I'm sorry to say this, especially when I look at addiction, the time when you could have stopped on your own is past.
Right.
A lot of times people don't recognize that they have a problem, and they've already passed that point where they can stop on their own. And so it's really about getting help and stuff. But I think you got to be able to talk about it. You got to be able to ask, who's an addict? When do I know? That kind of stuff.
Because we know that, change is a really mysterious process. We're not really sure. We think we have some ideas of how we push people to change when there's sort of various stages of readiness to make changes. But like you said, I've seen statistics of, like, say, 80 or 90% of people who stop on their own, who change on their own, so they overcome their addiction or overcome their substance use, who overcome their depression and actually get better on their own. And we don't hear from these people.
Right. And yet, a lot of times when I was working at the hospital, I would find people who had two illnesses. And it's that complicating factor of... I was reading in a paper today about a candidate for New York mayor, and they were talking about his father. And his father was a decorated World War II veteran who was wounded. Back then they didn't talk too much about it. He was an alcoholic, and he committed suicide. And the son was so angry at him that he dropped his name and took his mother's maiden name. And it was a good article. It sounded like a good fellow and stuff. but he talked about how conflicted he was with his father. And the reason I mention that is that I think that for some folks, and not all folks, but for some folks, addiction and alcoholism and a co-occurring illness go together. And in a way, it's the great tragedy. Like when I used to work with folks who had post-traumatic stress disorder from childhood abuse issues, and they end up finding relief in substances, and they end up sort of getting in trouble with that. And it might even been genetic. I mean, so anyway, I just say that, a lot of the folks I worked with, it was so, like achieving abstinence. I mean, that's great. I want abstinence. But there was so many other issues. Like one of the things that we're hoping to talk about in the future is relationships.
Right.
And, sometimes when you grow up and you don't have a good role model and you don't know what a good, healthy relationship is, and you haven't had, if somebody says you love you, I mean, you just struggle with these issues.
So most of us parent like our parents did.
Yeah, but you can get clean and sober and still, like, you want the American dream, but you find it's not happening, or you find out that you try and be in an intimacy or in a relationship, or you try and improve your life in some way, and it sort of is a struggle. Yeah. It's really hard to do.
You haven't been given a very good roadmap or instruction manual for getting there.
That's right, and you have to allow for the fact that it may not work. I mean, you may have setbacks, and again, we want to avoid using the word failure. It's not a failure. I mean, the failure would be to not try, and I still don't even want to use that word. So, we're going to talk later on this year, we're going to talk a little bit about housing. We're going to talk a little bit about psychopharmacology, I hope.
Right. So domestic violence.
Domestic violence, the impact of that on the family. And we're going to ask for people to come in and share this table with us and talk a little bit about it. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that when we get questions or comments from the audience, that they share a little bit of their experience and talk a little bit about some of the issues they faced in early recovery. Some of the issues that they continue to struggle with, and I'm looking forward to this. I mean, I think last year we spent some time on symptoms, and that's important, identification of symptoms and what to do when you see them and how to react to them. But I'm really hoping that this becomes a more active dialogue about people who have struggled with alcoholism, people who have struggled with depression, and their struggle to improve the quality of their life.
Yeah. I was flattered they asked us back for a second episode, much less a second season. But I like the idea that we're going to have other people coming in here to sort of enrich the dialogue that happens here.
Right.
But I think, as it's in our title about Let's Talk About Mental Health, is that dialogue and talking is so important around this. I mean, for example, you talk about the decorated war veteran who's an alcoholic, commits suicide. I was astonished, but when you think about PTSD as sort of a new illness, it's been around in so many different forms and so many different names. And I've heard stories about the old World War II veterans. Their wives would tell you that they're thrashing in their sleep, they have had nightmares their entire life, but they were of a generation who just didn't talk about it.
That's right.
And that's what really keeps stigma alive, it keeps the discrimination alive, is that people are not talking about it, they're not recognizing it as sort of a part of being normal. And with that then, people don't get the help that they need. And something like mental illness. 1 in 4 people will struggle with the mental illness at some point in their life. Well, that means with your standard family of 4, one of us is going to have a mental illness at some point in our lives. And maybe not necessarily the severe and persistent mental illnesses, which is how we categorize like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but an incidence of depression, an incidence of alcoholism. I think, I don't think any of us as a family where we haven't been intimately familiar with any of these problems.
And I think in some ways, and I'm hoping that, and I don't know this, but you almost have to change the next generation. And that, I know that sounds grandiose, but the idea being that, I grew up, my father was, some disclosure, my father was in World War II, he was in North Africa, Sicily, Italy. I don't know how much it changed him, but he was a quiet man. But he never talked about it, never said a word about it. The only thing he said to me when I was going into service was not to go in the Army.
Right.
No, really.
That's what he was saying.
Yeah, don't go in the Army. So I went in the Air Force. My brother Jimmy went in the Navy. But I mean, it was sort of, I know it affected him, You know what I mean? I know it was a big deal to him, but he never talked about it. And a lot of things like that, you know, whether it's alcoholism in the family or depression in the family. Like I know in our family, they never mentioned suicide. You know, and I have no idea, and yet I suspect that you would sometimes hear something that made me suspect that perhaps one of my uncles.
Right. Like he was cleaning his gun.
Well, I don't know. They never even talked about it. But I mean, the reason I bring that up, not to, you know, bring it down on my family, but I'm hoping that by us talking about it, that children will be exposed to discussions. I mean, a lot of like what they see is a mystery to them.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like they don't know what it is that they see because nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody wants to say what it is, and even the obituary. I mean, sometimes I understand. I want to not hurt anybody, but I really would appreciate sometimes if somebody said, "Well, he died of alcoholism," or
or he took his life. He committed suicide.
That's right. Without judgment, without a negative aspect. You know what I mean? But just sort of like, come on, be honest. You know, I mean. Let's talk about it. Let's discuss it. Let's say, you know, how many people do we lose to this? How many people do we sort of ignore? And then when it happens, everybody says, "Oh God, I didn't see that coming," or you know, I was really surprised.
Right, because we think these things are odd, that they're unusual, and that it's not normal. When it is very much. I mean, depression is within a spectrum of what's normal for all of us human beings, and as a part of that, people commit suicide. And have these things be considered shameful, again, as part of that stigma that's occurred. And stigma has not just been our mental illness, but it's been around forever. We've gone through in our lifetimes with stigma against various races, stigmas against people's certain sexual orientations, and the more we've sort of got to meet people who belong to these groups, the more we start to recognize that we're very similar, very much the same. And we get to understand what it means to belong to that group, and we no longer sort of look at them as other or different or an abomination. So it's really important to have those dialogues and have that conversation and meet with these people, get to know how they're living and what that's like, that life.
Right, and again, you know, this year, hoping that this would almost be like a forum. I mean, we can bring in experts. We can bring in people who work in the field and ask them for their opinions or thoughts about current events or topics, you know, that might be worth discussing. But I'd also like to hear from people who are personally struggling with this, and I would like this opportunity because they can do it without disclosing, without just give me your words, give me your questions. You know, we'll treat them with respect. We'll use them in the show, and I like to think, and you know, we've talked about this. We like to think that this is of benefit to someone. Now you can't measure sometimes something that doesn't happen, and I'm not saying that we prevent anything at all, but the idea will be. I mean, I hope to have a friend of mine on here talk a little bit about the struggle with adolescence and some of the things that come up with adolescence, and you know. I'm really looking forward to it. I just think, you know, being a parent is so difficult, and being an adolescent is equally as difficult. I don't think people appreciate just how difficult. I mean, for both people, you know. And so, if there's an issue involved, if there's any kind of like substance abuse, whether by the parent or the child, or there's a surfacing of some psychiatric illness that's beginning to become more apparent, or development of a personality issue. You know, it's.
I mean, nobody skates through life unaffected by any of these things. This is part of living. It's part of the struggle of being alive. You know, being part of a community. You know, living in the world as it changes, being together with other people, not living on our own. This is, you know, it's not always easy.
Right.
It's not always easy, and to not, rather than being discouraged, to realize there's some help out there. And they realize this is a normal part of life. I think if people knew that, it would have tremendous value.
Right. And Dr. Cluster and I used to work together in a hospital, and sometimes, you know, in the inpatient unit, you know, a lot of times you're really dealing with crisis intervention. A lot of stuff is going wrong, whether it's withdrawal or detox. I mean,
housing situations or partnerships breaking up.
Stuff, you know, and you just can't help. I mean, at least from my point, at this point in my career, in professional career, is that. Gee, I wish we could just help more people sooner.
Right.
You know what I mean?
But we used to often talk about that, particularly around addiction and working in a hospital setting. I think it was Jeff Kane used to say this, you know, it feels like you're just working so fast that people keep throwing bodies into the river and we just keep pulling them out of the river. Like, somebody needs to go upstream and figure out who is throwing these bodies in the river.
Right.
So we can start, and again, you talk prevention, talk about working with youth, talk about working with families, with young children, you know, getting that going, you know, as early on as possible. Tremendous benefits.
And the good news is there are people out there doing it. I mean, there's boys clubs, girls club, there's, you know, prevention, there's people
youth
working
services
on youth
here in
suicide.
town.
There's a lot of good stuff, and I think the schools are doing a great job. That's my experience.
Yeah.
I was on the school board for a number of years, and I think they're probably, I mean, sometimes you'll hear people talk about, well, we don't just do education anymore, we do social services. And they sometimes say it almost as if, you know, poor me. And I actually think it's great. And I think a lot of the people that I know that work in the school system are really quite happy about it. I mean, they take on feeding, they take on early identification. We have people doing it essential early ed, you know, that kind of work. And this is really important work. And but again, you know, you're sometimes worried, you know, we are treating a segment of the population that has come to our attention. But how many people are still outside of that identification?
Yeah, and there are different kinds of prevention too. There's sort of primary prevention, like sort of vaccines. You're trying to stop an illness from happening. Then you have sort of, you know, secondary and what's called sort of tertiary, where then you try to make the disease less once it occurs, or, you know, stop it from progressing, become even worse. So a lot of different ways to do prevention. But I think when you talk about the schools and everything they do, you know, they get everybody early on, early in their life, and with very few exceptions, everybody passes through school. So it really makes sense to try to put a lot of effort into treatment and prevention there.
And if we can, I mean, you know, we can only do so much. And, you know, I remember last year we talked about that we actually wanted to make this a little bit more fun. But it's hard to do that. I mean, this is serious business. And you know, I don't mind laughing at myself occasionally.
Right. I mean, we're in trouble if we can't laugh at ourselves.
That's right, but
we make enough mistakes.
But I would hope at some point we could get to a point where I mean, you know, treat this serious, not take ourselves too serious, but to treat what we're talking about serious, but do it in a way that people feel comfortable listening to it, people feel comfortable sharing what they hear with other people. I mean, that's really what I'm looking for. I mean, I'm probably being naive about this or idealistic, but I'm just hoping that from this dialogue, from us and bringing people in and talking more about mental illness and alcoholism and drug addiction, that we can begin to sort of become more informed about this and be able to be part of it.
And I think part of the idea of us being able to make fun of ourselves, it talks about sort of an acceptance of who we are and the things that we struggle with. And I think that's an important piece. You know, people speaking out, people being aware, people kind of accepting what's going on, not sort of fighting that, you know, why does this happen to me, versus it's happened to me.
You want to talk a little bit about our guests?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think next week we're going to have Mary Ellen Copeland is going to be on our show. And she's well known for something that's called a RAP plan, which is a Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And the reason why we thought that she was such a good person to have on for the first show is that what her work entails really is people taking an active role in their own recovery, their own treatment. You know, so often treatment is when something happens to people, and rather than you being an equal partner working with a therapist or a doctor as a consultant and having an active role in that. So that's why we thought that would be a great way to start this off.
All right. And I'm hoping, and not to set a trap for her, but I'm also hoping we can ask her a little bit about this whole idea of involuntary medication.
Right, yeah.
Because I think that's another thing people are going to be talking about.
Exactly.
So listen, I just want to thank everybody and for this opportunity, BCTV, and all the folks who are helping us put this show on, and all the people who have told me they've watched the show and they appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to this next year.
I think I'm gratified by all the feedback, and this is really wonderful to be back for another season.